my fellow peanuts, and welcome to anyone who is new to this channel or to this podcast. Now, this podcast covers true crime cases that may not be suitable for young listeners. There may be graphic and violent content. However, guys, with this episode in particular, I am going to be discussing the homicide and the abuse and disappearance of minors. Now, the victims are aged between the ages of 13 and 20, but I'm not going to be describing any of that type as sexual violence or any type of the torture. I'm going to keep this as sort of not detailed around that graphic content as much as I can. In particular, we are going to be going back to the state of Texas. I know I've done one already, but we're going to be talking about the serial killer's apprentice by the name of Elmer Wayne Henley. Now, he was an accomplice to Dean Corll. Now, he shot Dean. We're going to go through all of that. But if you get a chance, guys, go and watch The Serial Killer's Apprentice on HBO Max. It's absolutely fascinating. You will get to see a lady by the name of Catherine Ramsland. She's been made famous most recently for being the instructor and the teacher of the murderer of the Idaho College students. It was really intriguing to watch this one, guys. Just so you're all aware, we've got our Care Bears to the right. We've got my to be reading cart. This is from Amazon. I've got all of my books that I'm going to wanting to read, but we're going to get into it today, guys. It's really interesting. This one in particular, I'm not going to be focused too much on the serial killer today. I'm actually going to be focused heavily on the apprentice, Wayne. I'm doing something a bit different today. I realized that, but I wanted to sort of discuss this because I did find him quite fascinating, I'll be honest. So in the early 19th in Texas, teenagers set to become the accomplice of a predator who had targeted young boys around the Houston and Pasadena area. This episode in particular, we're going to actually examine Wayne's path, the night that he shot Dean, the investigation that followed, and the case's sort of impact without that sort of sensationalism around serial killers themselves. I'm going to be doing much more of a care for the victims and for their families. Now, at this time, right, when the murders were occurring, it's a city where kids were biking around to pools, the corner stores, and then unfortunately, they were just not coming home. They were disappearing. And it's these disappearances that really, they stunned neighborhoods and they really confused police. And in the middle of all of this is a young teenager, and he's only 17 at the time. And this is Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. He's first an accomplice, then he's the person who ends up shooting Dean Corll on August 8th in 1973. But tonight, we're actually going to unpack how a frightened kid became part of a horrific crime spree and what happened the night that Dean died and why this case itself still continues to haunt Houston. Now, one of the big things is in this time, guys, they haven't coined the term serial killer. So they didn't really know who they were looking for. In Houston Heights in the early 1970s, a tight grid of bungalows, and you've got some corner stores, summer heat. It's in this everyday life that grew a gentleman by the name of Elmer Wayne Henley Jr., who's born on May 9th in 1956. He's the eldest of four boys in what can only be described before his grandfather passed away. It was a love, it was faith, but there was a lot of violence after his grandfather died. Now, accounts from sort of that time describe him as bright, attentive, an avid reader. He would be at the top rank of his class. He was deeply religious, so Wayne actually wanted to be a minister, and he's encouraged to sort of continue being a role model for his siblings. At one point, he even wanted to be a stormtrooper. Oh my God, a patrol trooper. So behind this picture, though, it's actually his father who is very, very violent towards his mum. He struggled with alcohol. He was really physically abusive. And at times, Wayne was really protective of his mum and would often intervene in circumstances where perhaps a young boy shouldn't been exposed to that at all. Now, like many of the teens during this time, he really enjoyed that sort of loose moral sort of culture that's coming out of the 60s. It's the music, it's the freedom. And yet pressures at his home, they certainly continue to mount. Now, after his parents had divorced in 1970, he took some menial part-time jobs to support his mum. His school attendance was starting to slip. His grades fell. And it was just really the everyday life of being an adolescent, right? And it's compounded by the fact that he's sort of having to step into a more adult role in his home. Now, step outside sort of that, family home, and the story widens to sort of the neighborhood itself. Houston Heights was grappling with something no one really wanted to recognize, and they didn't really want to see it at all. It's a pattern of teenage disappearances. Boys roughly aged between the ages of 13 and 17, and they are vanishing from streets and like on the way to pools. They're on the way to being social, and fear pressed in the edges of those ordinary sort of, routines. Porch lights were often left on a little bit longer. Parents traced paths their children took so that they knew exactly where they were going. Wayne Henley actually knew some of the missing boys. At this time, he was not an accomplice though, guys. So in May 1971, when David Hilgeist and Greg Winkle didn't make it back home, he actually joined in that search. He wanted to make sure he was distributing flyers. He was consoling those parents and hoping for an explanation that really didn't end in any of those boys being harmed at all. So he's even admitted himself, Wayne, during an interview, that he had a bit of a hero complex. He wanted to make sure that, he was front and center. Now, that act itself, the one of posting flyers for his friends, it's very tragic in the end because of what he ended up doing. Now, families across the Heights that summer it wasn't great. It was marred by a lot of disappearances and a lot of unknown. There were rumors, there were theories, there's an undercurrent of something's not right in this town. But the police sort of didn't, and there was no real clarity with the police, the disappearances. They didn't look at first like just one case. They looked like isolated heartbreaks scattered across the city, right? It looked like boys just potentially ran away. But it did feel like for each of those families that they were searching alone. And it's sort of, they didn't feel like that detectives and reporters, that they were looking hard enough. And it wouldn't be until later that they would find out that it was a single predator and his teenage accomplices. It does matter to say, as much as I'm not going to be graphic, I do want to say the targeting of minors is part of why Houston felt especially exposed. Parents tightened their curfews, kids traveled with friends, but still there's an undercurrent of fear, and there's in the streetlights, you're looking out for your kids. Sort of in that atmosphere, Henley's world, home responsibilities, faith, flashes of adolescent rebellion, sat alongside that sort of tension that was growing under that current. By the time he'd started skipping school, he was going to pool halls, he really had no direction in his life. He meets a fellow teenager by the name of David Owen Brooks, a schoolmate with access to money, to a car, and it really set the stage for a very fateful introduction of an older man whose public image seemed really harmless. And this is Dean Corll, the so-called Candyman. Now, there's a reason why he was called the Candyman. It was because he used to hand out candy to the kids. Isn't that terrifying, considering we're now taught don't ever accept candy from strangers? It's Wayne's bond with David Brooks that began like many friendships, shared time, skipping school, a sense of freedom, bit of a rebellion. Brooks, he's 1 year older. He seems to have cash all the time. He's got a Corvette. And now the source of this was Dean. Dean's public persona connected to a family candy business. He's feeling really approachable. He's very generous. He definitely groomed both of those boys. He's cultivated a lot of trust with some vulnerable teens. He's offering rides, he's offering money, and it's the impression of adult respect that some of them lacked at home. It's in this space that influence can definitely be mistaken for care. Attention can feel like safety until control enters the picture. Multiple accounts describe Wayne initially admiring Dean's work ethic and his steadiness, confiding in him, and over time being entangled in some pretty risky and some pretty poor behavior. It started out as something as simple as petty theft, and then it would end up being abducting. When we will not describe that type of abuse, but it's enough to understand that sexual violence against minors was central to a lot of what Dean was doing. Wayne would actually later claim Dean framed the scheme as part of like a shadowy syndicate, a false narrative that used to normalize criminal acts and sort of mute that moral alarm in impressionable teens. Whether or not Wayne really truly believed that story, what matters is the outcome, right? Boys and young men were lured to places and controlled by Dean where they were harmed and they were killed. Wayne's participation would grow over time, and it would shift from recruitment to direct involvement, right? So facts that would later end up being what would come to his conviction. Now, for our listeners and viewers today, it's natural to really ask how a teenager would cross that line. The answer is really not that simple, and it's not easy to absolve. It does include grooming tactics, its power imbalancements, and its personal vulnerabilities. So that domestic instability, the economic pressure, and the craving for approval from an adult who seems really capable and really composed in his everyday life. Now, the tragic reality is that coercion and belonging can be manipulated into complicity, and especially when the targeting is young. I'm not giving, by the way, Wayne, any type of excuses. I'm just trying to give you a little bit of background so you can understand. So it's across 1972 and 73 that the crimes really intensify. The geography of the cases, they widen from apartments to storage sites, leaving investigators and families and eventually a nation really grappling over the loss of what would be called at the time the worst serial murder case in the US. So from March 24th in 1972 through to July 25th in 1973, boys and young men were lured around Houston Heights, Houston, Pasadena, Texas, and taken to locations that were actually controlled by Dean. Now, often this is with the help from David Brooks and Wayne Henley. At the time, authorities ultimately connected 29 victims to Dean's crimes. Henley is actually convicted of 6 of those murders within this span. The goal is to really teach you the timeline and the people, like the victims themselves. The story is going to center around 4 main locations, though. Dean's residences, the Southwest rented boat shed. That's where they would find 17 bodies. Highland Beach. Now, I believe there were 6 victims found there. And then Lake Sam Rayburn, and I believe 4 victims were found there, 27 at the time. So these places, named again and again in records and over a lot of media coverage, become the coordinates of grief where investigators would later find remains. Now, during the time where Wayne was with him, we've got the victim by the name of Frank Anthony Aguirre. Now, he's an acquaintance from the Heights, and he's lured later and found among the victims. Wayne's involvement is recorded in a lot of his confession and a lot in the trial. Then we've got the next victim, which was Mark Stephen Scott. He's known Dean from petty theft disagreements. He's also found among the victims. It would note that Wayne's escalation from recruitment to direct participation was around this time. So then you've got Billy Jean Balch Jr. and Johnny Ray Delhome. Yes, they're also teenagers. They disappear in May 1972, and their remains were later recovered. Letters to their parents were actually a part of that deception, and Wayne's participation is reflected in his confession and also in the trial. Then you've got in June 1972, would actually relocate to West Coast Towers. And sources would describe a shift in a more controlled restraint and a growing pattern of luring teens and private spaces under the promises of more hangouts. And then you've got in July 1972, Stephen Sickman. He disappears and is later located at the boat shed. Then you've got Roy Bunton. He was 19 years old. He was also recovered from the boat shed. The shed becomes really, really significant later, guys. As I said, there were 17 bodies found there. Then you've got in October 1972, you've got Wally J. Sumino and Richard Edward Hembry. They're abducted on their way home from a junior high, and they were also located at the boat shed. The families would actually end up recalling a sudden phone call that cut off. So I believe Simon had called his parents, and halfway through that conversation, he hung up. Then you've got Richard. He disappears after heading out to call his fiancée. His remains have been found. The pattern just continues through the Heights to Houston to Pasadena, with victims in their mid-teens to late teens. Now, most recently, the media coverage notes that the disappearances were initially perceived as separate incidences rather than one single case, so which contributed to really the police not knowing that they had a serial killer in their midst. Now, in the summer of 1973, the sort of final part before it all goes awry, at least for Dean. Now, when the case broke in August 1973, Boat Shed would become the first major recovery site. Police began digging that afternoon after the shooting of Dean, and they would unearth multiple victims and then continued searches around High Island Beach and near Lake Sam Rayburn. These recoveries transformed into scattered missing person files into a single devastating map for families. Families, unfortunately, whilst there is some aspect of closure, it's definitely an unwelcome amount of certainty, right? We're going to leave the details of those scenes to the record and focus more on some of the investigation and the community impact. Some of these identifications of these victims would actually take decades. One example, which is often really, really commonly noted, is Randall Lee Harvey. Now, he's a Houston teen who his remains were recovered in 1973. He wasn't identified till 2008, identification. That's a long amount of closure for that family. That's a long time for closure. And then you've got Wayne's sort of shifting at this time. I'm going back and forth a little bit here. Shifted from adjusting to luring to direct participation in the murders, and it's reflected over those 6 convictions. Separately, though, on August 8th in 1973, he actually shot Dean, and it's actually called self-defense. He was not charged with his murder. These are distinct legal threats: criminal accountability for 6 murders within a 15-month span, and self-defense regarding the shooting that ended that corruptness of pattern behavior of those serial murders. Now, at the time, as I've said before, it was the worst serial murder case in the US history. And what the timeline really holds, though, is the names and the ages of those families. Those families searched for those loved ones. They waited and they grieved. So I want to make sure that we're retelling the story around them and avoiding that graphic detail, because look, I'm quite graphic and so it's not like I'm changing my narrative, but just with this one in particular, we definitely need to focus in on the victims here. So before we move on, let's pause and acknowledge some of the lives that were actually lost. Names are often reduced to just case numbers, and each are tied to people. So you've got Donald Wayne Waldrop. He's 15. He vanished in May 1971 in the Heights neighborhood. Then you've got Randall Lee Harvey. He was only 15. Then you've got Jerry Wayne Waldrop, and he's the brother to Donald. Then you've got Billie Jean Volch Jr. He disappeared in 1972, and he would be recovered in the boat shed. Then you've got Johnny Ray, and then you've got Stephen Kent Sickman, and you've got Richard Allen Kempner. So each name really marks, for me, a life interrupted and a family that's left searching, and a community that ended up being shadowed in fear by the disappearance of all these boys. Now, in the early morning of August 8th, 1973, inside a Pasadena home, Wayne shot Dean and ended all of the disappearances of those boys. Within hours, he is cooperating with police, not only acknowledging what had happened that night, but also describing a wider pattern of disappearances that had haunted that Houston area. Prosecutors would later, though, they'd rule the shooting self-defense and no charges were filed against him, and that decision stands separate from the 6 murders in which he was later convicted of. One scene from that day when they searched it's probably ingrained in a lot of people's memory. After giving an initial account to officers, he actually asked to call his mum. And this is in the documentary. You should actually, it was really interesting to see that. And one of the reporters said, I've got a car phone. Is there anyone you want to call? And then he said, yeah, I want to call my mum. And then over this broadcast of watching it on live television, he actually says, Mama, I killed Dean. And this is where he confessed, and she is devastated. Mary is next level. She's like, no, you didn't. No, you didn't. Now, these statements really quickly shifted from what happened that night to where investigators should look. He guided officers to that rented boat shed. There was a lot of bodies found, and it uncovered multiple victims and establishing that was the main murder ground, we'll call it. He would then take them to additional burial locations, and that was the Highland Beach, and that was also the lake. You've obviously got videos and stuff going on in the background, guys, so you can sort of see that there were many things. Apparently, Wayne did not know there were that many victims. He was not aware of all the victims in the boat shed. So there's quite a grappling photo where he looks devastated. So I think that was it. But the first day, police started digging at that boat shed. They find 7 bodies before stopping for the night and then resumed over the next couple of days. It was the 3 sites. I don't think they really knew how much they were in for. It was, though, Wayne's cooperation and the names he knew, the accomplices, and he knew what was going on. But most importantly, though, Wayne's account corroborated all the physical evidence. It allowed families to have their victims buried and know exactly what was going on. Whilst I want to keep this as least graphic as I possibly can, every single one of those victims, it was disgusting what was done to them. There was a particular part in the documentary that I found disgusting, and the jaw was open because it was like the person was screaming. So that was pretty. They were all sexually assaulted. No child, teenager should ever have gone through what those boys went through. Now, separate murder charges tied to the period of March 1972 and July 1973. Wayne was convicted of 6 murders in 1974. He won a retrial and was convicted again in June 1979. The confession is often remembered for how much it shook the Texas people. A son is telling his mum what he'd done, and it stopped the killing. It unlocked all of those victims. And as the city was really forced to face the underlying currents of what the seediness can happen. By late August 1973, it had shifted once all of those bodies had been found, it shifted into a bit of a legal marathon. Detectives compiled statements from Wayne Henley and David Brooks, cross-referenced missing persons files, and they spanned it from like 1971 right through to 1973. The evidence, the physical recoveries, it all was corroborated by their confessions, witness testimony. They were able to tie each of the victims to Dean. And the first trial would open in San Antonio in July 1970. It had been moved from Houston to reduce local bias. I don't know how you reduce local bias, because at the end of the day, everyone in Texas knew about this. Prosecutors would actually argue that Wayne was not merely an accessory, but an active participant in 6 murders. Now, the defense team leaned heavily on Dean's coercion and his grooming, framing Wayne as a manipulated teen who ultimately stopped Dean. Jurors only deliberated for 2 hours before returning a verdict. It was guilty on all 6 counts, 6 consecutive 99-year terms, effectively like life imprisonment. He's never getting out. So a teenager is then bound to a lifetime behind bars. And whilst Wayne appealed, citing procedural errors and prejudicial testimony, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals granted a retrial, and in June 1979, he faced a second jury. The outcome mirrored the first, though. It was still 6 convictions and still 6 consecutive life sentences. This retrial cemented the legal narrative. He was still a convicted murderer, and whilst he was self-defense for Dean's death, he murdered 6 boys. Now, scripts from media capture, I've read through some of the transcripts of the trial, and Mary Henley would describe very heavily her son's troubled home life and her shock, because all she knew him as was this warm person who didn't want to hurt anybody. So if you ever get a chance, go and watch The Serial Killer's Apprentice, because his mum actually gives an interview before she died. And you do feel sorry for him in a lot of ways. And I was a little bit like, okay, I'm not so sure about this. So was he a calculating accomplice or a groomed teen who crossed a moral line? I think, yes, I think he was groomed. I truly do believe he was groomed. I truly believe some of the things that he'd been through in his childhood had stemmed that ability for Dean to easily manipulate him and make him a killer. But for me, there is some type of redeem. I do think potentially. So today, Wayne Henley remains incarcerated in Texas, though. He is serving his 6 consecutive life sentences. Over the decades, though, his case has appeared before the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, which prompted renewed coverage and opposition from victims' families wherever a review is scheduled. Recent reporting notes that the board's review continues to surface periodically, with family preparing victim impact statements every time. And so they should. They should definitely be able to talk to the fact that they're never getting their children back. They're never getting a part of their family back. So why should he essentially have an opportunity to have a life? And this is where I sit very, very much on that whole fence of, I want to not sit on a pedestal and say he deserves life, and I don't know. I did feel sorry for him. I really did, guys. I really did feel sorry for him. His accomplice, David Brooks, though, he died in prison in 2020. Whilst Wayne comes up for parole, I don't think he's ever going to get it, guys. I don't think he will. You've still got to think of those 6 boys, whether he killed them, whether he participated. At the end of the day, he needs to reflect on what he has done and everything that he did. Now, granted, the reason he shot Dean was because, long story short, Wayne brought some friends around, they had a couple of drinks, they all woke up tied up, and Wayne had somehow convinced Dean that he was not going to hurt him and do anything to him. He would help him kill his friends if he let him go. And ultimately that ended Dean's life, because the girl that Wayne brought over, he didn't want to kill her. So It's really interesting. Local coverage, it shows the parents and the siblings continuing to write letters and making sure that he's not coming up for parole. They attend hearings, they speak publicly, and so everybody knows their names, the boys' names. Now, survivors like Rhonda Williams have occasionally chosen to speak, describing the long arc of recovery and the complicated aftermath of being pulled into that history. Even after 1973, parts of the story definitely continue. That would be and a great example of that would be Randall Harvey, who's recovered in 1973, and he was only identified in 2008. Now, whilst there is at least one victim still unidentified, they are still continuing to make sure and see if they can identify that victim. The case has heavily influenced how investigators link missing persons files, especially when ages, neighbourhoods, and timeframes overlap. It's reinforced that multi-site excavation coordination, interagency information sharing, and clear protocols for juvenile victims. More broadly, though, the case sits with national conversations about grooming dynamics, adolescent complicity under coercion, and how a court balances those factors against an active participation in violent crimes. So again, is it right that we sit here and we don't talk about the fact that those victims would still be alive if they had never met, right? Like, because at the end of the day, if David Brooks had never brought him into Dean's world, would Wayne essentially be a killer? Do we think that he would have turned out to be a violent offender? So even half a century on, the Houston mass murders remain a touchstone of how communities remember loss, press for accountability, and protect the vulnerable. Now, whilst he's still in jail and parole boards, reviews do come into play, we've got to remember to say the victims' names, learning what the warning signs of grooming and coercion can look like, and refusing to really turn victims just into footnotes when we're talking about serial killers. Because I think it's really essential that we talk about the victims' names as much as we talk about the serial killers. Because at the end of the day, again, guys, it's the victims and their families that have that lasting effect on their lives. Now, I want to end this podcast this time on the victims and their names. So we have Jeffrey Allen Coonan. He was last seen in 1970. He was recovered at the High Island Beach. Then you've got James Eugene Jimmy Glass. He was last seen in 1970. He was at a religious rally with Danny Yates, and he was recovered in the boat shed, and he was only 14 at the time. Danny Yates is also only 14, and he was recovered in the boat shed. Then you've got two brothers, Donald Wayne Waldrop and Jerry Wayne Waldrop. They're found in the boat shed. You've got Randall Lee Harvey. Now, he was apparently on a bike on his way to work before he went missing. He was identified in 2008. Then you've got David Hilgeist. He was last seen in 1971 with Greg Winkle, and Gregory Winkle was found with him at the boat shed. Then you've got Rupert Haney. He's last seen in 1971 after he was off to the movies. He was also found in the boat shed. Then we've got the victims that were lured in with the help of David Brooks and also Wayne. You've got Frank Aguirre. He was recovered at High Island Beach. Then you've got Mark Stephen Scott. He was recovered at the High Island Beach. Then you've got Billy Jean Balch Jr. He was last seen in 1972. Johnny Ray Dellum. He was seen with Billy. He was last seen with Billy. He was also found at High Island Beach. Then you've got Stephen Sickman. He's recovered at the boat shed. Then you've got Roy Eugene Bunton. Willie J. Sumino. He's walking home from junior high. And Richard Edward Hembry. And he was also with Wally. He was recovered at the boat shed. Richard Allen Kepner. He was recovered and documented. So he was the one his phone call was interrupted. Willard Rusty Branch Jr. He was last seen in November 1972, unable to get an exact source. Then you've got Joseph Allen Lyles. He's last seen in 1973. And then you've got William Ray Billy Lawrence. He phoned his father about a fishing trip. He was actually found at Lake Sam Rayburn. Then you have Raymond Stanley Ray Blackburn. He was listed amongst the 1973 victims. Omar Lewis Garcia, John Manning Sellers. He was, but you don't have any exact months, but he is also among the victims. Then you've got another brother, the brother of Billy Bolch. You've got Michael, and he was misidentified in the 1970s, and that was so he was misidentified in the 1970s, and he's actually recovered by DNA in 2010. Then you have Marty Ray Jones. Then you have Charles Carey Cobble. And then lastly, we have James Stanton Drymaler. He was the last victim before the case broke. And then we do have one final victim, but he has been unidentified. There is a lot of forensic work going on in the background, and there has been a reconstruction of what he could potentially look like, clothing and facial approximations. Now, 18 victims have been linked to the boat shed, 4 to Lake Sam Rayburn, at least 6 to High Island Beach, and 1 at the Jefferson County Beach. Thank you so much, guys, for joining me on my episode today. Wow, Crimes from the Peanut Gallery. If you found this story as chilling as we did, please subscribe, hit that like button, leave me a comment if you like, but stay tuned for our next episode where I'm going to delve into another dark and twisted tale of serial killers. Until then, stay safe and be vigilant. Have a great weekend, my fellow peanuts. Bye.